Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you were all able to come this evening. My name is Will Hasty. As many of you know, I'm professor of German in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And I'm also co-director of the UF Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. And I'm very happy to welcome you all to the two Global Cultural Sustainability Symposia that I have organized for this fall. These symposia grow out of an initiative which is called Songs. And I thought I would, since this is the beginning and this is the first event, a sort of inauguration as it were, I wanted to speak a little bit about this Songs initiative and let you know a little bit what it's about. I'll preface my brief words on the Songs initiative by saying that it is first the product of a decade-long collaboration in online education at the University of Florida, most notably involving my German and LLC colleagues Franz Futterknecht and Christina Overstreet, who I'm happy she's here today, as well as a large number of graduate student teaching assistants over that same long period and up to the present moment. This is the mission statement that you'll find on the UF Songs website. If you search UF class songs, there it is. You can actually see it. And I'm quoting from that: the long-term goal of the Songs initiative is the construction of a sustainable online network for global cultural studies as a res publica in support of the public domain and public education. Songs explores questions pertaining to interdisciplinarity, digitization, and sustainability while working towards its long-term goal. Songs seeks collaborations in STEM, the arts and architecture, and support from the private sector for the design and implementation of the physical and material cultural resources involved in the construction of its self-sustaining, renewable energy-powered online global cultural studies network. Songs seeks to be self-reflective and self-determining in an enlightened sense by exploring via lectures, colloquia, panel discussions, symposia, such as the one we're about to start, live streamed and publicized via the Songs website, the sustainability of spiritual and intellectual humanist cultural resources based on perspectives in the humanities, arts, and sciences. In these initial remarks, these initial descriptions of the Songs initiative that is sort of the energy behind bringing people together to talk, I've suggested that the Songs initiative can be understood in terms of the construction of a self-reflective, perhaps self-powering res publica. And I would like further to propose that we need to understand this Latin res, or this public thing, not so much as a thing in the mundane sense, but rather as a kind of eventfulness in space and time that is as manifestly self-reflexive as possible. Spatially, for example, Songs combines the here and now of this lovely room with the stained glass windows and the wood paneling, with the multiple theirs of the places beyond this room, to where this event is being carried via the live stream. Temporally, there are two different but related ways that I can think of in which the Songs Initiative cultivates a self-reflective eventfulness. In a first temporal sense, the eventfulness associated with songs combines the immediacy of the live stream and of the events it is transmitting instantaneously with the greater permanence of the finished recording that will become available for review and study later. In a second temporal sense, the organization of the songs events this term into a pre-modern panel focusing on past history and a modern panel focusing more on our own time concerned perhaps more the modern panel with ongoing problems in the present moment, invites, I hope, the juxtaposition of longer-term intervals associated, for example, with the teachings of, longer-term intervals with the teachings of world religions, with ideologies, with different notions of human history as some kind of global process or narrative. Combining that with the ever more compelling, shorter-term immediacies of experience that are being placed at our fingertips via new technological developments. These are just a few initial reflections regarding the Songs Initiative and the role that will hopefully be played in this initiative by means of the cultivation, what I'm calling the cultivation of a self-reflective eventfulness. I hope to test the soundness of a mission conceived along such lines in ongoing discussions in future, as well as to draw attention to more potentially productive self-reflective, to more potentially productive self-reflections that I have not mentioned here. As also stated in the mission statement that I just read, I very much hope that the Songs Initiative and related global cultural sustainability symposia in the future will involve people in humanities, in STEM disciplines, in arts and architecture, and sciences. As a public-facing initiative, one that is in support of a res publica, it is not intended to be an exclusively academic university-level initiative. I will be trying to reach out to the degree possible to people of all ages, all walks of life, and I will seek collaborations with K through 12 institutions, for example, in this country, and to the degree feasible with corresponding educational populations abroad. So this has been a brief introduction to the initiative and some of the ideas associated with the Songs Initiative, behind which is the sort of impetus for the events that we're about to participate in this fall. I'd like to express my gratitude to the Waldo W. Naykirk Fund for making the Songs Initiative possible, and I'd like to thank the University of Florida Center for International Studies, the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, and the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies for their help in making this year's Global Cultural Sustainability Symposia possible. I turn now to the introduction of our guest speaker, the guest speaker of this pre-modern symposium, Professor Caroline Bruzelius, Anne M. Cogan Professor of Art, History, and Visual Studies at Duke University. In terms of finding a speaker who I think who would combine the sort of the longer-term broad sweep of cultural history with these new shorter interval kinds of immediate and instantaneous perspectives provided by new technological tools of viewing and analyzing, I'm very doubtful that I could have been fortunate enough to find a better suited guest for this pre-modern symposium. When I began looking for a speaker last spring, I was thinking from the start about trying to find an art historian who works in an area that is immediately evocative of medieval and early modern cultural developments in all their breadth and scope and grandeur and splendor. And it did not take me very long to find my way to Professor Bruzelius's work on Gothic architecture, but Gothic particularly grounded in or situated in urban settings. Basically a research that really is a sort of rich corpus that endeavors to understand the Gothic architectural styles and practices as thoroughly embedded in complex urban networks of cultural practices and cultural production. Professor Bruzelius has taken these projects in a variety of new, innovative directions in recent years that involve state-of-the-art digital visualizing technologies, among many other technologies being used. She's a digital humanist with scholarly expertise in medieval architecture, urbanism, and sculpture, and she has written extensively on religious architecture of the Middle Ages in France and Italy, publishing books and articles on French Gothic architecture, for example, Saint-Denis, Notre-Dame de Paris. Let's see, one of her other recent books in 2014 published by Yale University Press is Preaching, Building, and Buying Friars in the Medieval City. This focuses on how religious practices introduced by the Franciscans and Dominicans, such as outdoor preaching, visiting laymen in homes, and burying townspeople in convents, transformed cities. Professor Bruzelius is a leader in digital art history, exploring how digital technologies communicate narratives about art and the built environment in teaching, museums, and in research. She's a founding member of the WIRED group at Duke University, a group that integrates visualization technologies with teaching, engaging undergraduate and graduate students in multi-year research initiatives. She's a founder of 2 international and interdisciplinary collaborations, Visualizing Venice and the Medieval Kingdom of Sicily Image Database, and she's a major force behind the recent publication, I think one of numerous co-authors of a book that grows out of that research called Visualizing Venice, Mapping and Modeling Time and Change in a City, which was published just this past year. That's just brushing the surface. There's so much more, and I had to pick and choose, but I chose the books, I chose the Gothic, I chose the different directions that you've gone in, the innovative research, which of course a large number of people here present are especially interested in. And let me just say finally, Professor Bruzelius, from 1994 to 1998 was director of the American Academy in Rome. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of the Medieval Academy of America, the Society of Antiquaries, and has received numerous other awards in the United States and abroad. So I'm very, very happy and grateful to Caroline that she was agreeable to come to visit us in Florida. And having said this, I would invite you to welcome.
Thank you for coming. Is there a microphone? Am I supposed to have that?
No, you're okay.
I'm okay. So I want to thank Professor Hasty and the Songs Initiative and the University of Florida and your sponsors for inviting me. It's really very delightful to be here. Now I understand why everybody comes to Florida. The kids go to Orlando, the old folks go to Sarasota, and if they're rich old folks, they go to Miami Beach, and the smart people come here. So thank you for including me in your community for these few days. After that very elegant introduction, I'm afraid what I'm going to do is a bit rambunctious and bouncy. I'm going to talk about a lot of projects that are produced by my groups, which are at Duke and also abroad. And a lot of the work I'm going to show it's not professional, it's not made by a big company, it's made by us in the classroom and in the lab. I want to emphasize, though, that what I want to talk about is a new kind of research in the humanities. Interdisciplinary research. I work a lot with architects, engineers, computer science people. We do, as Will said, integrate technology into a series of courses at Duke, starting with freshmen, and we get them hooked with doing cool stuff. And then we welcome those who want to continue into a ongoing long-term research initiative, so they're part of a team and a little community. And all this emphasizes collaboration and gives them skills, like how to work together and not do things the night before it's due, and that kind of thing. So we have a very democratic modus operandi where really students often come with skills I don't have. And I offer things that they don't have. So it's very much a matter of sitting side by side, as I'll show you in a moment. And one of our goals is to engage the public, to open up stories about the interesting things we do, not only in the history of art, but in studying cities or systems, to the public. So outreach and communication seems one of the truly great components of this new digital world that we have entered. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of the spaces in which we do our work, because I think nothing would have happened if I hadn't been able to persuade the provost at Duke University that in order to do what we wanted to do, we needed a designated space. We couldn't close up after 45 or 50 minutes of class and take everything away. We needed big tables, we needed computers with the right software, we needed a space where people could come at 2 in the morning, that would not be me, but it might be a sophomore undergraduate, and work on a project, and where we could meet and talk. And so this is the Wired Lab at Duke, where you see people at work. And we also, because I'll speak a bit about the project, have an initiative in Venice. We created a lab there that we can use and our students can use, and which of course can be used by other faculty as well. All our projects begin with what? What if? What could we do if we tried to do this? What technologies would we use? What question would be appropriate? So these are all experiments. And I would say probably that nothing I'm going to show you is what I would call finished, like a published book might be finished. All these are kind of open-ended. Some of them are failures. But for us, it is more the process of the making and the learning and the working together than the final project. So it's really about how thinking through technologies into historical questions presents new types of concerns and questions and possibilities. And I will say that the reason why I've been so committed, the reason why for the last 10 years I've been hook, line, and sinker doing this is because it has pushed me as a senior scholar in directions I never would have thought of if I hadn't started doing this kind of work. So that's been extremely exciting. Now, the what-if questions are often about change, time, and process. I'll explain why in a moment. But they're also about why does the world we live in look the way it does? How can we understand, for example, this campus and where it began and how it evolved and what was developed in relation to what else? Works of art exist in time. So we have a series of projects under the rubric of lives of things, and that concept infuses our teaching as well as these research projects that attempt to engage with the material culture from the raw material up to the finished product, and then the acquisition of that object in a museum. And then, as I said, can we tell good stories? Can we communicate cool stuff to the public? Now, to come back to my first point, the question of time has always been very much part of what I've worked on. And when I was working on French monuments, I was often trying to study the stones and look at them in terms of what was the process of making this big building. How can we understand, and here's a drawing from my book on Saint-Denis way back when, in which I tried to show that as they were building the new cathedral, I have a pointer somewhere, but it went somewhere else. Well, I think this will work, yes? Let's see. Yes, that works, yeah. The new building, you can see here, going up as a kind of envelope around an old Carolingian church of the 8th century, which is here, preceded by a famous 12th century facade built by Abbot Suger. So how could we understand the coexistence in time of these various parts as the new building was being erected? But there's a huge problem with this kind of image. I loved it at the time, but now I think this is a static image. This is a frozen image. And now that we can make animations out of 3D models, and I'll show you some, we can engage in process as ongoing flow, as not as something static or a series of slices in time, but rather as something that is, as it were, in motion, that is amoeba-like, if you will, in its growing and changing, in that ongoing relationship between those different parts of this building, for example. And I'd like to show you, if I may, one project that is done by my collaborators in Padua, which exemplifies the kind of thing I'm interested in. This is the famous church of the Hermits, or the Eremitani, in Padua. This is done in Italian because it was produced in, I'm seeing it here, but you're not seeing it there. So something is not coming over. It's moving forward here. Why is it not projecting? Let me go back. No. Well, let's just skip that. I'll show you another one. So one of the early projects we did had to do with the mendicant orders. The mendicant orders are those new religious orders of the 13th century, the Franciscans and Dominicans, who lived by begging, right? Therefore mendicant. And their expansion into England. And this was a project done by, with two students of mine, Jim Knowles, who now teaches at North Carolina State, and Michael Kozitsky, who then went on to architecture school. We said, what could we understand from this archaeological article that showed the foundations of the Franciscan community and the understanding of the archaeologists of how the church expanded. So here's the original building, this rectangular structure that was expanded with a nave to the west, and then expanded again to the west with a tower. And we thought, well, let's try to make a 3D model. And so working with the students, we have nothing above ground here, by the way. In fact, these convents were completely destroyed, of course, in the Reformation under Cromwell, and their locations had actually been more or less forgotten by the end of the 16th century. So obliteration is the word, operative word here. But the excavations found the foundations, and we thought if we build it up 3D, we will begin to get at least a glimmering of what this complex might have looked like. And so we began to build models like what you see here. But because precisely that excavation engaged with the problem of expansion and change over time, we said to ourselves, let's try to make an animation. And I'm going to play now for you 1 minute extract out of a longer 8-minute
The models you see here are based on archaeological evidence gathered from excavations in the 1960s and 1970s. Back at the Franciscan site, the Greyfriars were embarking on their own series of expansions. In the 1260s, they completed a major addition to the north and west, incorporating the existing church as the friars' choir. A central bell tower was erected, and the main cloister was likely added at this phase. Next, the friars expanded the nave on its western end and added heavy buttressing on one corner, presumably to support a larger tower. Probably early in the 14th century, the crossing of the church was reconfigured. A new, larger northern nave was constructed, including 7 private sepulchral chapels along the eastern wall. By mid-century, the friars had added 3 more chapels, bringing the total to 10. The cloisters were expanded again, both here at Greyfriars and at the Blackfriars next door. The model as shown here represents the Franciscan complex at its largest. Along with the neighboring Blackfriars, its development corresponds chronologically with the happiest 100 years of the friars' lives in medieval England. In this period, the fraternal orders had grown from a small reform movement within the church to a position of unprecedented influence and prestige. As confessors to the kings and queens of Europe, they had seats at the centers of political power. In the universities, they had led an intellectual revival, doing path-breaking work in theology, philosophy, and the physical sciences. But darker times were approaching. Building on earlier critiques, by the second half of the 14th century, the anti-fraternal voices in England were growing louder.
So this project began with the question, how did the Franciscans and Dominicans move from being poverty-minded, from being begging, to having these extraordinarily large cloisters, which were deeply criticized in the 14th and 15th century by numerous authors, especially in England. They are described as being full of gold tombs and rich windows, so it was trying to test the literature against the archaeological evidence by modeling and by making this animation. This is an old project. It's about, maybe 6 or 8 years old, but it nonetheless, for me, exemplifies a lot of the things we were trying to do, which was understand a little bit more about these convents. The students, of course, had to write a narrative, and they had to perform it and coordinate it with the images. So it brought forth a lot of skills that were interesting ones, and I think I still like this project even though time has gone by. Well, the experiments that we were doing, especially with my kind of material, which tends to be medieval architecture, and because I had been teaching for some time in Venice and working with colleagues there, led me to suggest that maybe we could take Venice as a test case and try on an experimental and temporary, we thought, basis, try to see what we could do by using technology. And we called this invention Visualizing Venice. We focused on certain parts of the city, the Arsenal, the area of Santi Giovanni e Paolo, which you see in our 3D model here. It's a collaboration between Duke, the University of Padua, and the University of Venice, which takes documents, both archival written documents as well as visual documents, and seeks to interrogate the city through both text and image and engage with the question of time and change, like this campus, right? Venice has always been, as it were, in motion, and we were testing that idea around the city. It would have been nice to involve environmental science more in this project, but well, we ran out of time. But we were really interested in how the city reshapes itself within the frame, of course, of a rather restricted topographical area. So that project has had many offshoots and many results. I mean, we're just sort of floating through this assemblage of images that sort of put together images of students working with some of the products. Oh dear, let's move on. So, well, one of the projects, the most recent outcome of visualizing Venice has been an exhibition that was at Duke last fall, just a year ago in fact, and that also is going to be permanently installed, parts of it, in the Museo Correr in Venice itself. And it's done by several young, wonderful colleagues of mine, Kristen Hoffman, Ludovico Galeazzo, and Hannah Jacobs, and a team of students working in that same room I showed you before. The project was to take this remarkable masterpiece, chef-d'oeuvre of early printing, which is the view of Venice made by De Barbari in 1500. And this is a map, many of you will know it, I imagine, that's about twice as big as the screen you see here. So it's made of 6 plates, which of course are glued together, and it's a bird's eye view. It's not a map in the traditional sense. But to take this remarkable document and interrogate it on a number of levels. And there are many different parts to the exhibition that I don't have time to talk about here, but I'd like to show you a few examples of what the kinds of things they were looking at. One was, where are the bridges? So in this particular close-up, they colored the bridges. You can see the little red things here. Most of those bridges were actually going to private houses, across canals to private houses. So they were domestic bridges, if you will, not necessarily bridges for public access. This one by Santa Maria Formosa is a public bridge, but an awful lot of the bridges were private. So we can understand by this that people in Venice, of course, moved by boat. Most people who lived there had a boat. They had a gondola. They would float from one house to another. They wouldn't walk. And that was very interesting to think about when you take a document like this and begin to think about, ask questions of it, if you want, in that way. So they had the genial idea of asking questions about green spaces. Can we look at the De Barbari map and see who owned gardens, where were the gardens, where were the orchards, and identify them on the map. So this animation shows you, as you follow it, that the green spaces are mostly on the periphery of the town. And they're associated very often, in this case, with the cathedral complex on the far right of the city, or with religious foundations, or they're down on the Giudecca on the south part of the city. But it gives you some sense of how Venice, after all, needs to eat. So where do their apples and their pears come from? How can we think that a city like Venice is provisioned with food? And the De Barbari map, as our wonderful colleagues pointed out, is evidence for where the orchards were and where the gardens were. So in this particular palazzo, you see they had on the fringe of the city, on the Giudecca, they had enormous gardens. And the map is made with such precision that you can see the roses on the bushes. So it's really an extraordinary monument. Now, one part of it, to get back to bridges, was to think about how people move through space in Venice. And of course, the most famous bridge to go across the canal historically was the Rialto Bridge, which until 1590 was a wooden bridge, and you can see it on the De Barbari map here. You can also see all the boats in the canal. And you can see the complexity of this wooden bridge, which was in effect a drawbridge. Here it is in Carpaccio's Healing of the Madman. You can see people walking across it. You can see the vertical posts that go down into the canal. And you can see the plethora of gondolas and boat traffic that clusters around the bottom of this bridge. And it's really very fascinating. If you look here, you can see that there was some kind of pulley system right, that would pull back the spans across the canal at the very top. And so the team, working with some students, developed an animation of how they thought this bridge might have worked. So here we have an animation that is on top of the de Barbary map, right? It's inserted into the map, which you see hovering in the background. And you can see that, like a sled, the bridge, projecting parts of the bridge is being pulled back in order to make space for the boat we're on, the sailboat, presumably, right, to get through and get to the other side. And so making the animation and making the model made the students really think about, well, how could this thing have worked? How do you do that kind of retractable bridge with wooden materials? I'm not sure we have the right answer. I'm not sure it's detailed enough. But nonetheless, it's an interesting interrogation of this kind of project. And so now it's going back again. If you have a chance to see this exhibition, if you go to Venice, I think in a year or two it should be up in the Carrere, along with the wooden blocks which they have, of which they made laser scans, deeply fascinating, and I highly recommend a visit. So, as I said, everything we do is an experiment. Everything we do is an adventure, and we really don't know if it's going to sink or swim. But I'm talking about the swimming projects, are the ones that actually came up with results. And one of the most exciting ones for me was a project we did starting about a year ago that had to do with integrating the study of a historical building, now in Naples, with tools such as laser scanning and photogrammetry, ground-penetrating radar, and then making some kind of public-facing product. So what our subject was, how many of you have been to Naples? Well, so this church, the Church of Santa Chiara, is inescapable. It is really the biggest church in town. It was also a double convent that had both Clarissan nuns, female branch of the Franciscan order, in this enormous cloister back here, as well as, and you can't see it very well, but also a community of Franciscan friars who had a separate cloister on the right flank of the church. And this building, as we see it now, is one vast, undifferentiated interior space. Interesting space, really unlike any other building I've ever seen, and I've worked on medieval architecture now for many, many decades. It is a huge building, not very Franciscan in terms of being poverty-minded. It has these side chapels with round arches. Above the side chapels is a very wide gallery. You can see it here, you can see it here. And then it terminates with this flat wall on which there are the remains of several magnificent royal tombs, that of Robert the Wise, who dies in 1343 right here. And behind that wall is the nuns' cloister. Well, I can show you this in a plan. So this is the way the church looks. The side chapels along the side flanks, right, an open space here, the wall with the tomb and the altar, and then the nuns' choir back here. Well, we need to understand this as a series of separate and differentiated spaces, right? This red space was for the strictly enclosed female community. This blue space, but we didn't know how big it was the friars' choir, the male community, plus probably the royal family and the royal tombs. And then there would have been some kind of barrier, some kind of wall that would have separated the friars' part of the church from the lay congregation at the other part of the nave, which I show here in green, right? So this space was really radically divided. In the Reformation, almost everywhere, these internal divisions were demolished. They were demolished in order to make the clergy more accessible, more visible. The Mass could be seen as opposed to being removed and separated by walls. But once in a rare moment we have such a thing surviving, and one is the Franciscan Church, or one of the Franciscan churches of Venice, the Church of the Frari, where you see the choir wall, an arched opening with doors that can be closed, and that choir screen frames at the far end of the church Titian's magnificent Assumption of the Virgin. So you have a kind of dialogue between outsidedness and insidedness and funneling vision, but also keeping you back, as it were. Now we have to imagine that every medieval church had such a separation, but they're not there anymore. Take Chartres Cathedral, for example. Here's, of course, actually this is an old picture. They've now given it a bath and it's much cleaner and nicer, but Chartres Cathedral we perceive as this long open space, but until, in this case rather late, until the 18th century, there was a very richly decorated choir screen. Has relief panels, those would have been painted, it had altarpieces. In fact, this reconstruction drawing gives a better sense of what that would have looked like. In fact, at Duke we have a head of the Virgin Mary from this panel here, as it happens. So a very substantial masonry structure that would have required foundations underneath, right? You just don't plunk it on the floor. You have to have a foundation to support something with vaults, and that is a considerable mass of stone. So lay public kept back and into the nave of the church, whereas the high altar is in a precinct in the reserve of the upper clergy. Now that is, of course, one big, very complicated and interesting issue, and I don't want to go there today. But we have this great painting in Boston. It's an imaginary church. It's by Fra Carnavale, late 15th century, and it shows us such a choir screen. Again, monumental masonry structure dividing the church into different segments. And as you can see, inside these arched openings are secondary altars. And these altars would have had, of course, panel paintings. They would have had altarpieces. They would have had rich tapestries. They would have had textiles. These were very important points for lay veneration of local saints very often. And I'll come back to that point in a few minutes. So our question was this: where in that vast barrack of a church of Santa Chiara in Naples would that choir screen have been? Now this building presents problems. And one of them is the Allied bombardment of 1943, which for Naples was devastating, which burned for 3 days, which completely destroyed much of the interior of this church and its very lavish Baroque decoration. People don't talk a lot about the Allied bombing of South Italy, but it was very profound and devastating in many ways on a human, but also on a level of church monuments. And then after the war, this building was reconstructed and returned to a medieval appearance because it had been covered with Baroque decoration. So one could say to oneself, well, of course, all you need to do is look at the side walls, and you'll see traces of this substantial masonry structure about which I have been speaking. But no, because with old photographs, post-war photographs like this, you can see actually that they were resurfacing all the interior walls, giving them a new stone facing. So no traces above ground of the location of that choir screen survived. Our question was not if it was. We knew it existed, but where was it? And how to answer that question. In the absence of X-ray vision, we thought we could try to use ground-penetrating radar. Ground-penetrating radar is a machine, you can see it here, that sends radar waves down into the ground and encounters different kinds of resistance. And the one we were using, you can see it here actually, would go down about 1.5 meters. And it's like a lawnmower. You can see, we had to move these incredibly heavy benches and my back has never recovered. And then on top of this lawnmower type device, there's a laptop, and you can see that there. And so we established a meter wide grid on the ground, and we went back and forth with the ground penetrating radar. And this is really, I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow, talk about collaboration and teamwork. This was a team that involved colleagues from 2 universities in Naples, my collaborators in Padua, a young woman at the University of Salerno, plus the Franciscan friar, who's right here, Fra Vincenzo, who gave us permission, of course, to do this work inside the church. Well, very complicated to line all this up and to make everybody working happily together. But what we found was this. The evidence is in these sort of red lines, and I put a blue box around them just to show that there's strong evidence for a transverse wall between the side chapels here and the side chapels here, plus two forward elements that align with the next chapel forward. So we began to think that we were getting something quite deep and substantial, like those other choir screens of which I showed you images before. So we had the radar evidence, but we needed to insert it into a correct representation model of the church. And because ground plans and sections and elevations are often wildly off, we asked our young colleague at the University of Salerno if she could come and do a laser scan of the building. So here you have a laser scan instrument. And here you have, here it is again, this is up in those wide galleries above the chapels that I mentioned before, and she did it inside the building and outside. Here you can see all the points for which she used the laser scan. And then when that evidence of points is processed, you get an image. You get an exact representation that can also generate a plan of the interior of the church. If I had left my hat on one of the benches in that image, it would have come up in this laser scan. So it is an absolutely precise way of recording material evidence, and therefore, of course, so important for cultural patrimony that is at risk, because we can record and then we could print it out. In fact, I forgot to bring my little printout of this building, and it generated at the end a longitudinal section, for example, right, of the entire church. So here you see the nave, the galleries above the chapels, and here the nuns' choir at the back part, this very fascinating and strange building. Why was it important? Here you can see the difference between a model that we had done with the old measurements and the old sections in green versus the new information, substantially different, 32 feet in length, 17 feet in height, right, between the evidence from the laser scanning. So very important for us. It would have made no sense to put our radar evidence into a bad plan. It wouldn't have really worked. So on the basis of the laser scan and with some architecture students from Padua, we began to generate 3D models of the inside of the building. And these 3D models are simply precise renditions of the building you see when you walk into it. What we wanted to do was to take the radar evidence, which you see in this left slide, and the red, or the pink in this case, lines are where we have the evidence of foundations, right? And began to think about what did that mean in terms of the location and character of the radar screen. So we moved into thinking that we had something with 3 deep openings because of those forward, the forward 1 bay deep evidence of the forward supports, and that would generate a plan that was looking a bit like this here. Putting all that together meant lots of cups of coffee in the local bar, and here is an MA student of mine, Lucas Giles, cheerfully having his breakfast, spilling it all over our sketches, as you can see here. It was an iterative process of drawing and thinking and drawing some more, realizing, for example, in this sketch, that we were drawing a deep 3-bayed transverse wall, but it was too low. It didn't make a lot of sense in relation to the proportions of those side chapels I have mentioned. So through this process of discussion, drawing, and then beginning to 3D model, we pushed up the whole choir screen thing and understood that it really was a kind of integral part of the design of the church, that with the dimensions which equal those of the side chapels, we could imagine that these chapel openings, 1, 2, 3 here, march across the transverse wall, and march down the other side. So this choir screen was built, as we think, of course, as part of this building, as an integral part of the structure. And what was really beautiful was then we began to understand that the side galleries above the chapels, which nowadays are separate, completely separate from each other, this functioned as a kind of bridge from one side of the building to the other, right? You could walk down here, walk across, and walk up the other side. So that began to really change the perception and understanding of the building, if it is true. Not sure how visible that is. It doesn't look very clear from here. But what I want to point out is it addressed all sorts of issues about spatial zoning, right? Who has access to which part? How does church space condition vision and participation in the Holy Eucharist by gender, by social status, and who could see the royal tombs at the far end of the building, and how could they see them? So having access to architects, of course, was wonderful, because I'm not an architect myself. But these kinds of 3D models began to really make a relationship between the different parts of the building. And here, until the war, the tomb of Robert the Wise, this mega tomb, enormous structure, 3 times as tall as this room, its verticality perhaps can be understood in relation to the size of this choir screen, which we hypothesize went from one side of the building to the other. So one part begins to dialogue with another part of the building. And in that sense, we had a really interesting time, because when the GPR was finding the foundations and establishing the location, I looked to the left of the nave, and there was the St. Francis Chapel. You see it right here. And walking across on the other side was the St. Clair Chapel. Why would they be in the middle of the nave? Why would they be there as opposed to some more significant location? Well, they were there because that's where the choir screen was, and they were simply rotated 90 degrees into these side chapels when that choir screen would have been demolished. At least we think. We think that makes sense. So lay public, deeply attached, of course, to this extraordinary, charismatic saint of recent memory, Francis, and Clare as well, right, would have had their primary altars as the altars for the community in this church. So it would have looked like this. And the central opening, of course, would have framed the tomb of Robert in a really interesting way, created a kind of visual funnel from the point of view of a layperson in this part of the church towards that magnificent tomb that was over the altar at the far part of the building. So here you have, with and without, right? Here you have the building as it is now, and here is our interpretation of how that choir screen would have affected our perception of the space, probably not only with the altar of Francis, the altar of Clare, but maybe other paintings or sculpted reliefs, or even a magnificent crucifix on the top of it, and functioning, as I said before, as a kind of bridge, right, between these two very wide galleries. So for us at Duke, it's been very lovely to have friends and colleagues and collaborators in engineering. And they're much richer than we humanists are. And they have something called a virtual immersive environment. At Duke it's called the Dive. And this is what it looks like. It's a big box, maybe, 20 feet to a side, and it has 6 screens. So you basically are walking into inside a computer, and you have to wear slippers. Here are the slippers, and you have to wear goggles, right? Because of course the images are projected from all 6 sides of this box, and the goggles will resolve them. I'm going to show you some images of what it looks like when we took our model, translated it into a software called Unity, and put it inside the Dive. You can experience the model as real space, right? As space to scale, which is what we have here. And for us, that was really very important, because we began to understand a lot of things about vision and spatial division, gender division, and that kind of effect. And so I just have a couple of quick views of participants and students in that space. As you can navigate it, you can go up on those tribunes or those galleries, you can fly through the ceiling if you want. You know, you can be anywhere, any way, and it's a marvelous study tool, I will say, and been very marvelous for our projects that have to do with space, with environment, with architecture and reconstructions to test them out. We're also hoping that we're going to develop an app so that you could, with your iPhone or your iPad, walk into this church and then see our model of the choir screen inside the volume of the building. Now, I don't want to test your patience. Are you hanging on all right? Because I really would like to show you one last project, which is very different in character, but which has been a huge amount of fun, and has to do with activating the museum, making things come alive, and especially things that are out of context, and especially medieval sculpture. You probably all know that ancient and medieval sculpture was painted, but we never see that paint anymore. It has worn off. But aside from color, there is the odd fact of museums that we don't very often think about, and that is that museums are full of things taken from somewhere else and put together in a way that is deracinated, desacralized, decontextualized. And so these two poor ladies in this museum looking at glorious paintings, but the space has nothing to do, of course, with the intended space for those objects. Now at Duke, we have a terrible problem. We have a wonderful miscellaneous collection of sculpture that was bought in one big lot from some dealers. I'm going to try to get into, yes, that's going to work. No, it's not. I'm sorry. Whatever I'm doing here is not projecting to you. So I was going to show you the video of the gallery, the security video, which shows this space. And it shows people just walking right through it. Nobody ever stops. I mean, these are odd bits and pieces of things. This is a fragment of a column, and then we have heads floating on the wall. I always say, like the day after the French Revolution, and we have, bits and pieces of things that even a label really won't explain very well. And our question was, could we develop a project in which people would stop and look and think and have fun, right? It doesn't need to be too serious, but it could be a little bit serious. And so we selected these 4 figures here, which are all part of a much larger group, some of which is also in other museums in the United States. They're 4 apostles from an ascension group, so they would have been witnesses to another sculpted figure of Christ ascending into heaven, and therefore their heads are looking at different angles, as you can see. And these figures are perhaps about slightly more than a yard tall. And the fact that it was a group was interesting for us. We thought, what if we could project color? And so the students working with us, and again, students coming from computer science and engineering, developed a kind of iPad application in which you could select a color, and that color would be projected onto the sculpture. So we created a series of screens, if you will, through which the color would go, and you could paint up the figures, and each color, as you can see here, the story of red, would have a short essay on the origins of a medieval pigment. Where would they get this from in this particular color in the Middle Ages? And that's what happened. These figures, once a color was projected on them, began to leap off the wall, quite literally, and become amazingly attractive and attentive. And of course, as the project is set up, I have a link here, but my links aren't linking, so we'll just move on from that. But when you look at the gallery now, you can see that everything is monochromatic, stone-colored, beautiful stone, but nonetheless. But when we have the color projected onto them, they really do become very lively, and we don't care if you make a halo blue or you make the skin green. You know, it doesn't really matter to us. What matters is that people stop instead of just using this gallery as a hallway. They see those two iPads, they say, what is this? They start pushing buttons, and all of a sudden wonderful things happen. So here is my great colleague Mark Olson doing some public relations with young people, explaining to a girl, and we found kids really like this. And we have two iPads, so two kids can be there simultaneously, painting and changing each other's colors and coming to blows, whatever they want to do, right? And it turned out our provost liked it. And so here is Sally Kornbluth at Duke trying out the color projection. Even the president of Duke liked our project. So what we found was that people stopped, and they stopped and they lined up to take their turn at this, and it was really very successful indeed. And I particularly like this image of two kids at the iPads poking the buttons. I like these red stockings. You know, kids completely absorbed and looking at color, but also looking at the sculpture and paying attention to this in a way that nobody had been doing before. So there's a new problem in the museum, which is that they don't want to go home. Parents to kids, can we please go home now? And that's been kind of a fun development for, you know, medieval fragments. So I'll conclude with that. Audience to Caroline, can we please go home now? Thank you.
So, would you entertain questions?
Oh, certainly. With pleasure. Yes.
Can you say a few words about the project that didn't link in the beginning in Padua, the Aramatani one?
Yeah, I would love to show that to you because now this
There we
church is especially well known because Andrea Mantegna painted one of the most fabulously important cycle of frescoes in this building. Andrea Mantegna. And the team in Padua took this home between the art history department and the engineering architecture school. They did laser scans, they did photogrammetry, they did 3D modeling. What they were trying to do was to understand the life of this building. And that included, of course, changes to windows, the addition of chapels, and you'll see right now that it wasn't big enough. So they tore down the facade. Usually I can control this, but I didn't. And put up, you know, extended the church to the west with some external niches at ground level, which would have been tombs. And so you have a wonderful example in this church of the interaction of lay patronage. I want to be buried here, but I'm going to give you a lot of cash, kind of thing, right? In the monumentalization of certain noble families, and you can see their coats of arms there on the tombs. And then they're going to begin to do things like add doorways, right there where the red square is, and bit by bit, like barnacles on a pier, they're going to attach family burial chapels to the sides. If I can drive this a little faster, and maybe I can show you that. Right, each one of these is a family chapel being tacked on to the exterior, so very much like barnacles. And you get this cluster of chapels, all lay patrons, competing for attention, and the last of those is going to be the enormous Ovitari Chapel, which was painted by Mantegna. So these chapels were not only architecturally ostentatious, but they were also painted by the great painters. So you can think of Santa Croce in Florence, the Bardi and Peruzzi chapels, painted by Giotto, of course. So your family burial chapel was home away from home, an ostentatious display of your wealth and good taste, as well as sacristies and structures like that. I'm going to move this forward. The building gets more and more clogged up. And time goes by, it becomes a parrot, and they change the windows. They expand the chapels. This is what I mean about the lives of things, right? That the original building is just a casing onto which so many things are added, and at some point it becomes a parish, and they add a little apartment on top of some of the chapels, which is pretty cool, a chimney. And this is based on historical documents, of course. And then we move forward, and we get to 1944. Again, Allied bombs, catastrophically damaging this building, but above all obliterating that famous chapel with the Mantegna frescoes, which survive in powdery pieces. It was very important to understand that what was destroyed, what wasn't destroyed, and then what was restored and what was taken away in the restoration, and what was put back. So starting in 1944, they restore the building to a version of its former life. And that is in itself, of course, a very interesting debate. And here we have it pretty much as it looks today. What I'd like to do, if I can, is minimize that and go and show you what I love about this site, which is that they also, Madonna, we don't want Harvard right now. Video. Thank you. I'll do. They also could embed this website with images of the war damage. And I'm trying to move to the left and having a terrible time without help. Hello. To show you some war footage of the fascist era, which shows the way in which this destruction. So can we slide over and we'll get to the film footage from the wartime. This is, what I love is, this is an example of using the website as an integrated, documented video. And let's go to Teenage Jonas. If you go down to video here and the top one up, click on that.
Is this the one you want to show?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Thank you.
Visita le rovine della chiesa degli Eremitani che i criminali dell'area hanno ferocemente colpito, distruggendo, tra le altre opere d'arte, i celebri affreschi del Mantegna. Dopo una cerimonia religiosa, alla presenza della popolazione ancora dolorante per i nefanti delitti dei cosiddetti liberatori, il ministro inaugura una lapide che ricorderà nel tempo le infamanti azioni terroristiche del nemico.
But terrifically interesting, because it reminds us, of course, that when we think we're looking at a medieval place, right, we're looking at a version of something that has undergone so much change in animations, combined with archival photographs and so on, can really make all this accessible to the public, as my colleagues from Padua did so brilliantly here. That was a long answer, I apologize.
Oh no, that was great. Thank you.
I do have a question. My name is Marty Hilton. I'm Director of the Historic Preservation Program here at the University of Florida. And we have, through our Center for World Heritage Research and Stewardship, we have an initiative called Envision Heritage. So we've been using laser scanning, photogrammetry, a range of different digital imaging techniques for heritage sites. So it's interesting. A couple of the students couldn't be here tonight, but they're live streaming. One of them texted me the question she had for you. She wanted to know what was the software that was being used for the 3D kind of reconstruction that you were just showing of the church. Do you know what?
For this one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in this one, they're actually using something called Historic Building Modeling, HBIM.
Yep.
And into which you can embed all kinds of evidence, right? Photogrammetry, laser scans, historic photographs, and so on, and fuse all those images and then treat them. I think their final product is with Unity, but I'd have to double check with them. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, HBIM for historic preservation, I think, is right now state of the art, as far as I know.
Yeah, we have a PhD student actually. She's just over the next year will complete her dissertation. She's looking at HBIM, but creating it, basically creating a digital historic structure report or conservation management plan internationally. That's what
I should be more precise. Historic Building Information Modeling is
Right.
what HBIM stands for, and it's a wonderful tool. Yeah. Yes.
I gather that part of the charm and interest and wonder of working with these new technologies is engaging in a possible reconstruction or a possible build of something where there's a little bit of creativity involved. For example, the Rialto Bridge, that's something that stayed with me, right? And so there was an idea about how that bridge possibly works, and so the question was basically trying to figure out a way that you could be somewhat creative and create sort of a workable bridge that presumably uses materials of the time and engineering of the time. And then out of that grows perhaps insights. Once it seems like you've made kind of maybe some right conjectures about how a particular object might have been made, other things maybe start to fall into place in terms of, oh, well, if it was made this way, then we can see how the wood could have come from here, that this might have gone this way, this might have gone this way, etc. What I'm doing is, am I postulating in the right direction in terms of how this kind of approach using these technologies and actually making something along the lines of the way it might have actually looked? And then that actually then begins to tie into what we know about the way, from manuscripts or whatever, or from visual images. I'll stop. I feel like I'm starting to ramble a little bit too much, but I guess I'm interested in these tools and their efficaciousness somehow, and maybe revealing how things work in the success cases. But then you mentioned sometimes they don't work so well, and I'm just interested in that aspect.
So I would say for us, modeling is a means of reasoning. It's a way of thinking on paper. And you know, Leonardo da Vinci did that. I mean, modeling is part of thought. It's economic thought. It's part of medical thought. We don't know necessarily that our models are quote unquote true. We build models that seem to make sense to us under the circumstances of the particular project. All of them are hypothetical. All of them are negotiable. Nothing is a closed topic. But it is, can I say, our best guess. For example, for the choir screen at Santa Chiara, when I gave a talk about this in Rome in June, they said, well, maybe the door was smaller. And I said, yes, maybe it was. But we liked the idea of a large arch that gave a view of the tomb of Robert the Wise at the far end of the building. But you're welcome to take our model and give it a smaller door. You know, it's not a problem for us. It's a question, of course, of a best guess. But making a model, for me, is a profound part of trying to understand. And interestingly, making models and animations has made me think back to my earlier research work and think and has re-emphasized to me the importance not of understanding a building as a finished formal project in the Albertian sense of the perfectly proportioned thing, but as a kind of growing, changing, renegotiated structure even as it is going up. And one example might be Notre Dame in Paris, right, where It's an enormous building, the biggest building exponentially of its time. They haven't even gotten to the end of the nave yet. When they think, oh, it's too dark, they made it taller, I believe, while they were working on it. It got to be very dark as a result. Let's rethink those windows. And they redo the windows even as they are trying to complete the nave. So this building, and many buildings are, if I may put it that way, in dialogue with themselves. In dialogue with themselves and with everything else around them, but kind of working things out and then changing things even before they have reached the crystalline form of the finished product. They are undergoing change. And why is that? Because medieval architecture is slow. Nowadays, you're going to build this thing across from where I'm staying in a year maybe, right? But medieval buildings took 20, at best 30, 40, 150 years to even come to some level that you could call finished. You have to remember, let's say in Florence, that the cathedral and the Franciscan church never really got a proper facade. They just never got around to it until the late 19th century. So buildings, Dante's Florence would have been scaffolding everywhere. We don't think of that. We think of the buildings we know, but they were underway and not very far advanced necessarily in the time of Dante. So this idea of engaging in process and time and change through technology has been fascinating and very important for me as somebody who thinks about built space, whether it's a city or a building. Long-winded answer to a long-winded question. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Well, hi, this is fascinating. I'm just starting as an archaeologist, who works in the ancient past, Colombia in North America. My question is, am I loud? I can be loud. Okay. You ever have an opportunity to populate those buildings with historical agents so that we could actually experience them vicariously through their eyes rather than a Western gaze?
Well, what a good question. I haven't tried that. Maybe I'll go home and do that. I haven't done it yet.
Accounts sufficiently detailed?
No. I mean, we really, we don't have, for my period, we hardly ever have information about construction of a building, much less who went where, who was there, that kind of thing is very, very inaccessible to a medievalist of Western art anyway.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
Did you ever experiment with play of light?
Oh, yes, we did. Right. Well, in one of the projects, especially my colleague Kristen Huffman has her freshman students reconstructing churches that were demolished after Napoleon's conquest of Venice and after he closed down all the convents and churches, and many were turned into schools or museums. That's the academia, but they were also just demolished. These freshmen are using SketchUp to rebuild, on the basis of plans and views, buildings that nobody's seen for 200 years. And of course, one of the fun things is to think about repatriating the paintings, which are now in somebody's museum, and putting it back on the altarpiece in this building, and then think about what was the composition, how was the composition of that painting intended in relation to light source and that kind of thing. We haven't gotten very far with that because, life is full of things to do, but it would be fabulous to take that forward. And I love the fact that in our group, it's very much faculty and graduate students and undergraduates all working together and problem solving and learning from each other. And I learned an enormous amount from the much younger people that I work with.
I can understand that.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This was I'd like to just say I thought it was a fascinating talk. It went in lots of interesting different directions, and I'd like to thank you for your lecture this evening, and we look forward to your workshop, to your panel discussion tomorrow, 5 p.m. here, and then we have a workshop also in the Scott Nygren studio in Library West at 12 o'clock. So thank you very much.